definition of outrageous might be a little further out than maybe some others. So, most everything goes. Also wanted to let people know we have a link to, hopefully people received a link to our last seminar from September, which featured Jessica Phillips and Jackie Tulsky. And so if you did not get a link to that, please let us know and we will direct you to our famous YouTube channel. Our next seminar will be in January, January 12th. And that will feature Rachel Bedard, who's a palliative care physician. And then one note about our annual meeting. So we decided that we're going to keep our annual meeting virtual this year. It seemed to be the format that most folks seem to prefer. We're going to have it in April 20th. Save the date. Linda just put a save the date note in the chat. So more information will be coming. We'll send out an agenda shortly before that meeting starts. And we'll also tag that in our newsletter. The next version of our newsletter will be December. And amend, Bree, you're hiring someone. So I don't know, Linda, if you want to put a link, if anybody wants the link to the RA position that we're posting, which is going to support network activities and amend both, but we'll get a link there in the chat. All right. Have I covered? I think I covered all the announcements. Yes, I got through my list. So I was like even jotted down little notes. I was like, make sure I get everything, or else Linda will reach through the screen. All right,
Can I reach through the screen for just a quick second?
Yes, go ahead.
To mention that this RA position is working directly with the network and working with Amend here in San Francisco. So just want to make sure that people understand that we're hoping that applicants for this position would be Bay Area local. That is not don't discourage people, but I do want to let you know that, the Bay Area candidates will get priority.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so we're gonna get cracking here. So I'm really excited that Daniel Landsman from Families Against Mandatory Minimums is here to present to us today. He's a Deputy Director of State Policy and works with advocates, legislators to promote FAMM's Second Chance agenda and pass second look sentencing and compassionate release legislation. And fun fact about Daniel is he's a big bluegrass fan and was just regaling us with his playing the mandolin before you all came in. He played a couple of Bill Monroe tunes. No, just kidding, Daniel. But we were talking about bluegrass. There's a bunch more to your bio, but I'm gonna sort of turn it over to you so you can have more of the time talking, and so I'll be talking less. So without further ado, welcome and thank you so much again for presenting to us.
Absolutely, and thank you, Nick and Bree and Linda and the rest of the Arch Network for having me here today. It's a real honor and pleasure to get to talk to you all. So I'm going to talk today about writing and presenting for political impact. Quick agenda for this presentation. I'll start with just a really quick introduction about who FAMM is and what we do. And then I wanted to take a moment before getting into how to impact change with research and sort of writing to the unique bird that is legislative audience and talking about opportunities for political impact and just look at the state of justice reform in 2020, especially with an election that just occurred this week, where crime was a huge topic of discussion leading up to it. So I'll go through that and then I'll give some tips about writing for a legislative audience and sort of what makes this audience unique and how it impacts how you write. What academics and researchers can bring to lawmakers that advocates such as myself are not qualified to bring and don't have access to. And then we'll talk about some opportunities throughout the legislative process for political impact. And then perhaps a little selfishly, I will pitch partnering with advocacy organizations. I hope that's not too sort of self-serving. And then there's a slide for sources. So first, as Nick mentioned, I'm with FAMM. We're a national nonpartisan nonprofit organization that's dedicated to creating a more fair and effective justice system that that respects our values of individual accountability and dignity while keeping our communities safe. Since we were founded in 1991, we've led successful campaigns at the state and federal level to improve sentencing laws and prison conditions. Victories include the passage of the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 at the federal level, the First Step Act of 2018 at the federal level, and the repeal or reform of mandatory minimums in states such as Michigan, New York, Florida, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Missouri, Tennessee, Georgia, and Iowa, and in California, and much needed reforms in compassionate release at the federal level and in states such as Illinois and California. So as you all know, we just had an election, and crime was a big talking point throughout, and sort of to understand why and how it may impact us going forward as we, attempt to improve either conditions for aging people in prison or mechanisms through which we can get them out and bring them back home. We got to go back a little bit to 2020 when our country experienced a pretty sharp uptick in certain violent crimes, particularly murder, aggravated assault, and motor vehicle theft. So between 2019 and 2020, murder rose by 28.9%, aggravated assault rose by 11.7%, and motor vehicle theft rose by 11.4%. These rises were seen across all geographic regions and in urban, rural, and suburban communities. So this was not something that was exclusive to big cities. It was not, divided along blue state, red state. It was felt, throughout the whole country. One thing that's important to note is property crime and some violent crimes such as rape fell during this time period. So it was not an all-encompassing crime wave where crimes of all types were shooting up. In 2021, the picture is a little less clear. Part of that is because the FBI changed how they collect local data for their annual uniform crime report, and many major cities were not involved or haven't switched over to the new system. But other sources such as the Center for Disease Control and the nonprofit organization Council on Criminal Justice show that while murder rose again, it rose at a much slower rate and maybe plateauing than it did in 2020. Importantly, I would like to point out, as well as organizations such as the Brennan Center have pointed out through their fantastic writing on this issue, the data does not support repeated claims that criminal justice reform policies are to blame for this rise in crime. What actually caused it is a little murkier and harder to find out, as I'm sure those in the criminology space understand. But the data is pretty clear that this is not something that can be easily placed on things like bail reform in New York City or anything like that. But nevertheless, crime has become a top political issue again, as it has been in the past. There are leading narratives, as I alluded to a moment ago, in places such as Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, and other big cities that has placed blame and rise in murders and other crimes squarely on the shoulders of criminal justice reform, which is often tied to democratic politics in the area, despite data to the contrary. This has led to some setbacks, including the New York legislature rolling back their 2019 reforms around bail and pretrial discovery, both in 2020 and in 2022, as well as the recall of San Francisco's District Attorney Chesa Boudin. According to Gallup, 2022 saw at least a 21-year high, that was as far back as the report went, for Americans dissatisfied with our nation's policies to reduce or control crime. For the first time in at least 21 years, a plurality of respondents were, quote unquote, very dissatisfied with US policies on controlling crime. Gallup also found that 56% of voters felt that there was more crime in their local area than a year ago. And that was the highest mark for that question in the 5 decades of polling. And then lastly, I'd point out in the first 3 weeks of October 2022, Republican candidates and committees spent nearly $65 million on ads focusing on crime. and Democrats spent $58 million in the same time period. And so this is just, example of what folks likely saw in the run-up to the election. On the top left, you have an ad attacking Governor Kathy Hochul for crime in New York. Bottom left is an ad attacking Lieutenant Governor Fetterman, particularly around his enthusiastic embrace of clemency and pardons as Lieutenant Governor. Bottom right, you have an attack ad from the right on Republican Governor Stitt of Oklahoma, who also embraced his role and his clemency authority as governor. And then at the top right is an exit poll that CNN conducted, and NBC News' exit poll had similar findings that crime was, tied for third, a distant third, mind you, for top issues for voters behind abortion and inflation. So some initial takeaways, mind you, I'm more of a policy guy than a politics guy, but I did think it would be helpful to place this conversation in the context of what we just saw and are still seeing as votes are materializing. So, first takeaways, many national experts and pundits predicted that fears around crime, along with other issues, would play a part in the national red wave. This does not appear to have materialized. While control of both the Senate and the United States House of Representatives remain unclear, it is clear that whoever has the majority will have a very slim majority. And Democrats, who again are mostly more closely associated with broader reform policies and were hit for reform policies and attack ads, were able to pick up trifectas, meaning that they control the state House, the state Senate, and the governor's office in Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, and Minnesota. Additionally, reform-minded district attorneys won elections in Dallas County, Texas, Oklahoma County, Oklahoma, Hennepin County, Minnesota, which is Minneapolis, and King County, Washington, which is Seattle. So some positive pickups there for criminal justice reform. There were reports in the media of possible upsets, quote unquote, in elections such as the New York gubernatorial election and the Pennsylvania Senate race because of fears around crime and public safety. And while Democrats, Governor Kathy Hochul and Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman won their respective races, it is possible that concerns around crime hurt their margins. Representative Lee Zeldin, who was Kathy Hochul's Republican opponent, outperformed previous GOP candidates in that race, and Lieutenant Governor, John Fetterman underperformed Attorney General Shapiro, who went on to win the governor race as a Democrat across the state. And finally, political analysts and pundits have suggested that ads attacking Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes of Wisconsin on his support for cash bail reform contributed to his close loss to Senator Ron Johnson in Wisconsin. Additionally, the swing rightward in New York City suburban areas such as Long Island and Westchester has been tied to concerns around bail reform and crime in New York City, and that may result in several losses for congressional and state Democrats. Excuse me. So first, I just want to say why this all matters. First, in my opinion, the election was not a very clear victory for either side of the criminal justice issue. There were some variances in regional successes and failures for people who either explicitly campaigned on criminal justice reform or was tied to criminal justice reform throughout, the campaign. Plus the impact of much, larger issues such as inflation and abortion just don't provide much clarity on a national question around crime and the elections. This may lead lawmakers to be hesitant in 2023 and perhaps 2024 to really go out in front on criminal justice issues. This may be a combination of electoral fears as well as just criminal justice fatigue, as this issue has just dominated the airwaves in the run-up to the election. So I think this informs how both advocates and academics should approach lawmakers and present evidence and arguments. I think public safety will be key given what we saw in the run-up to the election. So now that we have a little context for the current moment, we can look at how to leverage research and the data that you all are collecting to advance reforms. So I think it's important when you sit down to write for a lawmaker audience to think through what the goal is. if the goal is to be persuasive and persuade a lawmaker to either introduce or support legislation or oppose bad legislation, it may be more necessary to pair the empirical data that you all have gathered through your research with some more value-driven prose and language to sort of get on the same level as the lawmaker and sort of appeal to their values and the values of their district. If you're just trying to inform the lawmaker and engage in more general education, then it's totally great to just let the data speak for itself. So those are some questions to ask when you sit to write for a lawmaker audience. As far as what to think about when you're writing for a legislative audience, I think the first and most important thing is to keep it short. For general purposes, for supporting legislation, bringing ideas forth for legislation, opposing bad legislation, you want to aim for 1 page if possible. Testimony or requested memos can be longer, but unfortunately, journal style writing and length is not suitable for having much impact with legislators and other policymakers and their staff. This mainly just has to do with a resource issue and a time issue. Legislative sessions move very quickly, and so the shorter the better. The next big piece of advice that I would have is to write to a lay audience. So assume no or limited background knowledge on the subject. State legislators deal in many issue areas. Some have no staff, some have purely administrative staff, and some may have policy staff, but just one. And so these folks are running the gambit on issues important to the state. And so, they're jack of all trades, master of none. So you want to avoid things like acronyms. Always sort of spell out if there's an acronym that is well known in your field, assume that they don't know it and spell it out. Avoid sort of scientific or field specific terminology and jargon. If it's necessary that be in, I recommend describe it and define it immediately, and try to avoid using field specific jargon as much as possible, and focus on sort of the meat of the issue. I understand that in academia, methodology is a huge part of research. It's not something that's going to be necessarily important to legislators. I think, especially with everyone's sort of criteria and expertise, they're not going to be as concerned about methodology. So I would, in lieu of writing to a lay audience and keeping it short, sort of focusing on the meat of the issue and not focusing so much on things like methodology and literature reviews and things like that. Another good tip is important findings on top. Even if something's 1 page, it's not guaranteed that they will read the whole thing. So put the key, most important findings within the first few sentences. So that way, if they only get 30 seconds to look at it, they know exactly sort of what point you're trying to get across. And then last and honestly least, this is not wholly necessary, but designing written materials for lawmakers with a little bit more flair can be helpful. Offices can get dozens of leave behinds, little 1-pagers that are brought along on meetings, and so it certainly helps to stand out. So those are some of the key tips for writing for a legislative audience. It's something that I myself have to be reminded of constantly by our communications department, that certain references to statutory code or some small agency are not what we want to include in these writing materials. And so next we're going to talk a little bit about what academics are uniquely positioned to bring towards presenting to a legislative audience and impacting outcomes throughout the legislative session. So number one, and this will be very important in upcoming sessions, is the impact on crime. Now, this is not going to pertain to every bill or issue area, but if it does, lawmakers are going to want to know what its impact on public safety will be. And so data around that is going to be hugely important. The second big thing is costs. So this will not always be possible to determine to the last penny, and bills with substantial costs will receive a fiscal note that'll have the state's own estimates. But this will be top of mind for most lawmakers. So proposals around improving care for aging people in prison will often raise cost questions, especially if it includes things like new facilities, new equipment, new full-time employees. This will be good information to have and bring to the table when meeting with a lawmaker. Another important thing that academics can bring lawmakers to help with political impact is best practices for non-correctional settings. So as I'm sure you are aware, there's often a big gap between what happens to aging people on the outside and inside prisons. And a lot of times when it comes to differences between the correctional setting and the outside, it's easily dismissed as necessary for security or things like that. So being able to draw on best practices, in medicine and palliative care and geriatric care and things like that should not be ignored for incarcerated patients. And I think that's something that lawmakers really respond to and will listen to. Next is qualitative or quantitative data from stakeholders and impacted people. So information gleaned from qualitative interviews with stakeholders such as correctional physicians, correctional officers, parole officers, as well as directly impacted people are very valuable for lawmakers to hear. And it's not something that they would easily get otherwise. These are not sources that they have great access to. And so being able to bring that and present that to them through your own research is highly valuable. Next, information on the state of the current system. So what the state is doing that you're in and where you're trying to impact change is always helpful. This can be wide ranging for this topic. So information on percentage of living spaces in correctional facilities that meet, functional requirements of the older population, the ratio of geriatric care providers to elderly incarcerated people, et cetera. Just bringing that data that establishes that there is a real issue that necessitates urgent legislative change is something that can be brought to lawmakers through research and is not easy to get elsewhere. For example, in California, Ria Desai, a great graduate student in the University of California's Joint Medical Program, conducted an analysis of California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation data to find the number of people who were successfully released under California's compassionate release system and compare it to the number of people who were denied, the number of people who could not find suitable release plans, and the number of people who tragically passed away before the process can be completed. This information was not only very motivating to our bill sponsor and sort of, lit a fire for him to get really engaged on this issue, but it certainly legitimized the urgent need for this legislation because her findings found that a lot more people were dying than getting out, and the bill was ultimately successful. And then finally, program evaluation, and this is drawing off of the above point a little bit. But lawmakers are tasked with oversight of government systems and the implementation of their laws, but unfortunately, there's just not enough time to do all of this. And so that end, research that evaluates the success of programs is of great value to lawmakers. So research that looks into the implementation and success of new legislation, new regulations, new programs are hugely important to advocates and lawmakers. A good example of this is Dr. Jennifer James, who I believe is in attendance today, and her colleagues' research on Connecticut's contract with a nursing home that's, explicitly for the placement of aging and ill incarcerated people. And so this research is not only valuable to Connecticut policymakers, but policymakers in other states who are facing similar issues around placing these vulnerable individuals and the best path forward. So those are a few ways and a few areas where academics bring incredible sort of irreplaceable value to engaging in political impact. So real quick before we move on, I just want to lay out the sort of basic legislative process for passing a bill. So obviously you start with bill introduction, and then there'll be a policy committee if the bill is going to move forward in its House of Origin. So that's the House of Representatives, it's a House bill, the Senate if it's a Senate bill. Typically, if costs are involved, there'll be a fiscal committee hearing as well. Then it'll go to a floor debate and vote. And then once it passes the House of Origin, it'll follow a similar pattern in the second House. So that's just a quick and dirty overlay of the legislative process. So now I want to talk a little bit about the opportunities for impact along the legislative process. And this applies to academics as well as advocates and, anyone who wants to engage in the political process at the legislative level. So first, starting with bill drafting and introduction. The best time for your work to impact legislation is before the bill has been drafted. Bill drafting provides a great opportunity to utilize your research and writing to inform the actual language of the bill and direct lawmakers to a specific course of action before politics, truly takes over. At this point, when you're drafting legislation and thinking about introduction, more options are going to be on the table. Now, things may get negotiated out or amended out throughout the committee process and the floor debate, but at this point, things are a little bit more wide open as folks tend to want to not negotiate with themselves. Bill drafting in the legislative off-season, as it were, is also the best time to leverage long-form research and writing, such as journal articles and book chapters. I guarantee they won't read these during session. I can't promise they'll read them out of session, but this is certainly the best chance to leverage some written material you may already have that was not necessarily developed for the legislative audience. This would be a good time to bring that forth and leverage it with lawmakers. The next big opportunity is going to be in the committee hearing. Now, in most states, a bill must receive a due pass recommendation from the relevant policy committee before it can be considered for a floor vote. Unfortunately, not every state holds, a real formal hearing where witnesses can testify, though some states such as California, Washington, Oregon, Maryland, and other states will accompany these committee votes with hearings that are open to expert witnesses. And so this is another great time to leverage your research and expertise to impact legislation. So committees are going to provide two opportunities to leverage research and expertise to either advance good legislation or kill bad legislation. The first is live testimony. During a bill hearing, the committee will typically allow a few expert witnesses to provide oral testimony in support or opposition of a bill. This provides an excellent opportunity to either synthesize the breadth of your research or focus in on one aspect of the legislation in more depth. Witnesses are often asked questions from the committee members afterwards, allowing further opportunity to address your expertise and research. The downside to live testimony is witnesses will typically only be allotted 1 to 3 minutes, depending on the state and the committee. So it's important to state your position up front on the bill if you have one, and to really be succinct. A good example of how expertise and research can be leveraged in these situations is Dr. Leah Rohrvig, who provided very specific testimony on the phrase end of life trajectory in support of the compassionate release bill in California. That was a massive sticking point. It wasn't a lay term and it was unavoidable. And so to get the message across to lawmakers that this is best practices in the fields of geriatric and palliative care and hospice care, it was critical to have that opportunity to leverage Dr. Rohrvig's research and expertise in this area. The next opportunity that the committee hearing provides is written testimony. This is for those who are unable to testify or for people who do testify to supplement their oral testimony. And nearly every committee will accept written testimony. This is a great opportunity to dive further into issue area than the oral testimony would allow. I will say all the rules that I mentioned earlier about writing and presenting to a lay audience apply here, but you do have a little bit more leeway to get more specific, pull in from your research in a greater capacity, though I will say that these should be no more than 3 pages. But anything that you feel you aren't able to get at in in like a one pager, as I mentioned before, this is a great opportunity to bring that information in. Next, I want to talk about is lawmaker meetings. So this is sort of the bread and butter of what I do in legislative advocacy. These can happen at any time during the legislative process. They can happen, before bill introduction, after introduction, before committee, after committee, during a floor vote. These are sort of what make legislative sessions and bills run. So if you are able to take lawmaker meetings, these provide an opportunity similar to live testimony, but on a much smaller scale. You can expect 10 to 30 minutes with a lawmaker or their staff. This is your opportunity to provide your expertise in a condensed and easily digestible format. So I would refer back to the writing guidelines, speak to a lay audience, avoid specific terminology and jargon, acronyms, things like that, and always bring a leave behind. So a one-pager that sort of synthesizes everything you want to talk about. These are critical as they allow a lawmaker to refer back to the sheet or allow legislative staff to easily relay information to their boss. The final opportunity for impact I wanted to address is op-eds and to a lesser extent letters to the editor. So these are really beneficial as they will allow experts and academics and researchers to communicate their findings directly to the general public. So there's benefit along the lines of public education. These are also helpful to apply pressure as legislators do care about the opinion pages in their local publications. Generally, there are going to be three great opportunities to write an op-ed during a legislative push. One is to correct any inaccuracies that may develop and be spread around about a particular bill. Number two is to provide context around reforms that are being discussed or considered, particularly from your specific field, an area of expertise. And finally, just general public education from a recognized expert in the field. That goes a long way. I could write, that compassionate release is the right way forward for public safety, but I'm an advocate. So my background is going to expose some bias to the readers, but someone trained in palliative care or criminology is going to have a little bit more leverage and a little more impact because of the recognized expertise. For an effective op-ed, there are 5 things that you want to look for that are briefly summarized on the slide. First is to quickly and upfront establish credibility as an expert. So talk about your experiences, universities that you're at, programs that you're a part of. Establish yourself not just as an advocate, but someone really qualified to talk about this from an empirical and authoritative manner. 2 is to summarize the problem and empirical data in favor or opposition to the legislation. So keep it short and punchy and concise. 3 is to present the most compelling and authoritative findings. This is not, the best place to put all of your findings into one area. You're going to want to focus on perhaps the 1 or 2 most convincing and definitely the most empirically supportive and authoritative finding that you have to help get across, the support or opposition that you're proposing. 4, I've said it a million times, but it bears repeating, and this is something that I struggle with too, as I mentioned, is just to remember to write for a lay audience, assume no background knowledge, and avoid, the key things we talked about. And then lastly, a good op-ed is typically around 500 to 700 words, and most outlets will have a word limit in that range. For letters to the editors, it's somewhat similar, but on a much smaller scale, and those are used to respond to other op-eds or other pieces from the publication, and those are going to be around 50 to 100 words with all the above information applicable. So now that we talked about legislative opportunities for impact, which is the bulk of what I do and where my knowledge lies, I did want to point out 2 areas where their impact can be made outside of the legislative realm. First is the executive branch. So as you all know, the governor has great authority over the state prison system as well as clemency authority. The head of prison systems also will typically have regulatory or rulemaking authority that can be utilized to improve conditions for aging people in prisons. While these offices are far better staffed and will have a great level of expertise as a result, previous advice does apply regarding length and terminology. And secondly, judicial branch. So research can be incredibly beneficial to lawyers seeking relief for their clients, and these orders can often have wide-ranging implications. These instances, though maybe less practical and predictable, allow for longer form research. A good example is Dr. Catherine Beckett and her team of graduate researchers at the University of Washington through their research, uncovered stark racial disparities in capital punishment in Washington state. Their findings were so severe that the Washington Supreme Court ruled that the Washington's statute for death penalty was unconstitutional. The key factor in this overarching ruling was Dr. Beckett's 45-page analysis that's now known in the state as the Beckett Report. So this opportunity certainly allows for longer form and deeper research. And then lastly, I just want to talk quickly about partnering with advocacy organizations. Obviously, the benefit to us is very clear. You all have an incredible breadth of knowledge and a ton of data and information at your disposal that's valuable to us. So I just want to make a quick pitch on how we can be valuable to you all. First is advocacy organizations can help place research in the context of pending legislation and emerge empirical research with a more overarching values-driven campaign. What I mean by this is advocates and advocacy organizations may have more leeway to bring in, I don't know if subjective is the right word, but I will use it, sort of subjective takes on it to talk about, fully embrace things like racial justice and compassionate care and things that, may target specifically the values of lawmakers rather than relying on the empirical data itself. Second, lobbying regulations vary by states and can be restrictive. And so organizations with lobbying infrastructure can help distribute researchers to legislators and staff. And finally, advocacy organizations can help coordinate and facilitate meetings with the legislature, including planning panel events where you can present your research directly to lawmakers and their staff. And then the last resource I want to point out is FAMM has a Second Chances resource library. This is an online library of resources that work in tandem with FAMM's Second Chances agenda more broadly, which includes second look sentencing, compassionate release, and executive clemency. So any research you guys produce or articles that you think would be helpful for other advocates or other academics to read, and it is in line with things like compassionate release or clemency or second look sentencing, please feel free to visit the Second Chances library and forward us your materials. There's an easy way to do that through the link, and we'll be happy to get it up so that more folks can make use of it in their own states. And so that is my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. That was great. If anybody has questions, go ahead and you can unmute yourself or post in the chat. And I saw that Johnny Perez posted one comment or question around your thoughts on multi-voice op-eds. So the different areas or with different types of experiences.
I think they're great, especially if I think two great sort of templates can come out of that. One is, you say, folks from another field, sort of merging together two academic fields and bringing that sort of multi-layered expertise to an op-ed can be really beneficial. The second is to pair sort of an academic voice with a directly impacted voice can be really important because there's two sides of this. One, you have to show to lawmakers and the general public that what we're proposing works. It's backed by empirical data. We're not pulling things out of thin air. The other side of it is, we still need to change hearts and minds about how we approach people who are involved with the criminal justice system. And I think, the best way to do that is to, lift up the voices of people who've been directly impacted by the justice system. It's one thing for me to say, oh, this is great, you should do it. But someone who's been directly impacted, can speak to their own experience. I think that's far more powerful.
Justin Burke, you see your hand there. Go for it.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk, Daniel. This is really great. I have a question. You'd mentioned the engagement with lawmakers and using live testimony or in-person meetings. And I always worry that a lot of those are so performative in that I've seen these live testimonies and it's unclear if the senators or representatives are truly undecided at that point, if they're just going to vote in block. And I guess, do you have a sense of what the most effective form of that type of advocacy is. Is it live testimony? Is it the in-person meetings? And then is it in-person meetings with very specific senior leadership?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, in-person meetings directly with lawmakers is sort of the bread and butter of moving a bill, and it is more important than committee hearings. I mean, I don't want to undercount the importance of committee hearings because the members may have made up their mind. A lot of folks have great staff who sort of prep them before committee hearings, but it does create a good record for further steps in the legislative process. So going back to Dr. Rorvig, you know, I think we had a pretty good sense that we were going to pass the hearing, but it was important to establish a record of what end of life trajectory was before the lawmakers, so that we could pull on it and pull from it as we approach the floor and go into the second house. And so having that was really important. But yeah, I mean, definitely one-on-one lawmaker meetings are important, especially folks in leadership, like you mentioned. So the relevant chairs, the chairs of the relevant committees, you know, staff and leadership. So, you know, majority leader in the Senate, Speaker's House, Speaker's office in the House are going to be the most bang for your buck, if that makes sense. I hope that answered your question.
I have a question in the chat from Catherine Nawani. Do you have advice for keeping track of new bills in your state? So standard
Yes.
process for doing that.
So I have been spoiled because we have a great software called Fiscal Note that helps us greatly with that. And, you know, I think it's a high cost resource, so it may not be immediately available to everyone. But, you know, certainly all of this is made available on the legislative website, and some places even have a sort of built-in system where you can track bills through the legislative management service. So that would be something to look into, and you can track by keywords. And I think a lot of them are free. But unfortunately, I don't have a ton of great advice because we use an expensive software that does a lot of it for us.
As we wait to see if anyone else posts in the chat, I had a question for you, Daniel. Just you had mentioned a couple of times, you know, keeping things short and sweet, and you know, using empirical evidence. You know, I give one example from your talk of crime. You know, it's quite clear if anyone just bothers to look at the data, the crime trends, and yet people ignore that. They ignore the science, ignore the evidence, which is pretty clear, other than homicides, but lots of other violent crime falling for decades. But then using this narrative of fear, which is much more powerful than the narrative, here's the empirical science, here, I'm a researcher, here's what the data show. And then you're in opposition, you know, a legislator or a candidate for governor saying, no, you're right to be afraid because crime is out of control. So how do you reconcile that as researchers? How do we, you know, in this sort of climate where, you know, we're trying to get science, empirical evidence in front of lawmakers, but then a lot of times we hear lawmakers make stuff up.
Yeah, I mean, so I think when lawmakers make stuff up, that's a great opportunity to leverage things like op-eds, because you can sort of call them out directly. I think another thing that's helpful, and this is going to go back to partnering with advocacy organizations, is, you know, say, you know, you show the empirical evidence that shows that crime trends, and you know, this one little blip in the pan, you know, or on the radar doesn't necessarily mean we need to go back to, you know, no good time, truth in sentencing, long sentences, and they bring out, you know, one story. Partnering with an advocacy organization like FAMM is we have stories to counter that. And so, you know, you can look at the empirical evidence and pair that with a story of someone who was, you know, immeasurably harmed by the excessive sentences that often come out of these conversations. And so I think pairing those two narratives of this is what the data tells us, this is what science shows us is true about crime, and counteracting any anecdotal evidence of, sort of one bad crime, to, pairing that with a story of, well, this is what your solution is going to lead to, can be very helpful. Sorry, I got jumbled up at the end there, but I hope it was clear.
Any other questions for Daniel? Jen, did you put yeah, I see your hand. Go for it.
I did. Yeah, this was great, Daniel. Thanks so much. I have two questions. One for you and one that's maybe more of a group conversation question. So my question for you, you were talking about sharing, quantitative and qualitative data. And something I've noticed sometimes is a thing with like reporters is I can like quote, like I talked to somebody and they said this happened and they're like, great, can I talk to that person? And I'm like, well, no, because it was research and there was an IRB and I said they'd be anonymous. And so I was curious how that works with legislators and if we should have a person who's experienced or if we should be able to name people we're quoting or if it's fine that if they're comfortable with the idea that it's research and it's separate. So I'll just start with that one.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a great answer because we face that all the time as well, where, we'll be like, we know this family who, they watched their loved one die in prison. It's like, oh, we can talk about it. It's like they don't want to talk to reporters. And in your case, it's even more serious with, the anonymity attached to, IRB and things like that. I think what I'll say is it would always be better if you could have the person there. But the fact that you can't, I don't think it should stop you from bringing on that information. And I think the fact that it is part of, official research project, you've got the IRB approval and things like that, excuses it a little bit. Wherein with advocacy, it's just like, oh, the person doesn't want to talk to you. I hope that makes sense. I think you have academics have a little bit more leeway and a little bit more trust because, these have been approved research and this is what you all do for a living. So there's a little bit more trust and a little more leeway than if I was just to walk in and be like, hey, I know I'm just an advocate for FAMM, but I heard about this guy. He's real. You have to trust me. I just don't think that would fly in the same manner.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And that actually feeds right into my other question, which was, I'm curious your thoughts on this and how others approach this, but there's such a weird thing with this type of work where like we can come in as like an expert, quote unquote, those of us who are academics and speak on behalf of an issue. And then there's also like real people who have, I would argue, much more expertise than we have in a lot of these topics. And I'm curious your thoughts or suggestions on like how to balance that, or like when should we say, yes, I'll come or I'll speak or I'll be the one writing the op-ed versus when we should say like, no, this should be somebody who's living this. And I'm curious how others weigh those decisions out and decide when to sort of step forward and when to step back. But also if you have experience on like, if it's at a legislative session, it should be this person, or if it's an op-ed, it should be this person, and how we should sort of weigh academic expertise with all the other forms of expertise in this work.
Well, I guess I'll just start. I think it just depends on what you're trying to accomplish because the messenger is going to be very important. I think unfortunately, it really just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. I think if you're trying to assuage concerns from lawmakers that we're in sort of a 1 in a million violent crime wave and things like that, then a researcher is going to be a better messenger there because they have the skills and the background at their disposal to sort of conduct and pull from high level research that sort of brings the truth about violent crime trends and what have you. I think if you are trying to really connect with a lawmaker and bring them in from the outside, maybe they're not fully on board with what we're trying to do. I think someone with direct impact is important in those situations. I don't know that high level research is going to pull them in. I think it's human experience and things like that. And on the op-ed front, it's a similar situation. I think if you want to prove that long and life sentences are bad for public safety across the board. An academic researcher, might be the best messenger for that. If you want to talk about what long sentences do to an individual, and how those impact things like their community, their family, then obviously you want someone who's had that direct experience. But I think if you put someone with direct experience, who may not have a background in sort of criminology, to write an op-ed that's like, over the last 30 years, crime trends have shown this, there's just a big disconnect from the message and the messenger.
Super helpful hearing your thinking on that. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Any other final questions, comments? Okay, well, giving you a virtual applause, Daniel. Thank you so much. I won't ask you to bust out your mandolin for us.
It's in arm's reach. If people want to be, very irritated as I try to pluck through whiskey before breakfast. I did want to say before I go that I've put my email in the chat. If anyone thinks of other questions or in the future, wants to talk through changes that could be made in their state or at the federal level, informed on your research, we're all ears.
All right. Well, thank you again so much. This has been really outstanding. Really appreciate it. So we're kind of getting close to the top of that. We're just going to kind of, I think, just keep rolling and everybody sort of do some chair yoga, stretch a little bit, wiggle your fingers, do some lion's breath, I won't do that here, but so we're going to kind of pivot now to a work in progress. So we've got Victoria Humley here, who is a fourth year doctoral student in criminal justice and criminology at Georgia State. And she has an MSW already and has worked for the Georgia State Unit on Aging before going on to embark on her PhD studies. Her interests are on health and aging in prisons and reentry among older adults. So Victoria, I'm gonna turn the mic over to you, and same kind of format, 40 minutes-ish, give or take, or however much time, Victoria, you want, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. So step right up.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, I'd love for this to be a little bit informal because I want a lot of feedback from all of you. So I'll try to keep it short as far as the slides I have and just leave more time at the end for y'all to give me some feedback. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay, I think y'all should be able to see that.
You're good. Yep.
Okay. So I'm just going to kind of go through them like this if everybody can see okay. So as Nick mentioned, I'm in my fourth year of my PhD program, and I will talk about this a little bit later, but I defend my dissertation proposal in December. And so I'm kind of at that point in the program. Thank you. And yeah, I've completed some interviews and I'll talk about that, but I really just wanted to present, why I'm working on this, what the project is, and then see if anybody has interest in this, if they'd like to provide more one-on-one feedback, or just today have a discussion about thoughts and ideas. So just a little bit of a brief background. In our department, we are able to have a 3-paper dissertation, so it'd be 3 publishable papers as the result. So the overarching topic of that dissertation will be aging, health, and end of life for people impacted by the criminal legal system. One of those papers will be an end of life decision-making policy review paper that's already been published. And then the other 2 papers I'm hoping will come from the data that I'm collecting that I'm going to present on right now. And the reason why I decided to do this work, as Nick mentioned, my background is in social work and gerontology. I've worked in aging, specifically in dementia work. And my interest has always been the experiences of older people in the prison system, and then more recently, interest in the reentry experiences of older adults. And, you know, I felt strongly, I've been in Georgia, I'm a native Georgian, I've been in Georgia my whole life, but I felt strongly about basing my research in Georgia because I feel like it can give a little bit of a snapshot that maybe research from other states don't have. We are an aging state. We do have a high rate of incarceration in our state. We also are known for, I don't have the exact data, but we are known for having a lot of people on probation in our state, having really long probation sentences, much higher than the national average. The data right now shows that about 44,000 people in Georgia age 50 or older are on parole and probation, so that's a lot of people. We're also a non-Medicaid expansion state, so I'm really interested in how that's impacting people not having that access to Medicaid in a way that that perhaps other experiences in other states, other people have. The other interesting aspect of Georgia is, I think it's been within the last 6 or 7 years, we kind of reorganized the way our systems work, and now we have a Department of Community Supervision where parole and probation are together, and from my understanding, officers have caseloads of both parole and probation. And they also in 2019 have, I hate to use this language, but they claim to have a person-centered model of supervision. So the state of Georgia has said, our Department of Community Supervision has a person-centered model. And so that really piqued my interest when I saw that when I was looking into our, State Department of Community Supervision, and really, what does that mean? There's no real definition of what that means on the website. I am having a hard time getting people to talk to me, which I'll talk about later. But because of my background in gerontology and in aging practice, person-centered care is, obviously a really hot button issue in that area, especially when it comes to nursing home care and other residential settings. And so I thought, how can I kind of marry this gerontological approach, this aging practice approach with the criminal legal side? And what does it mean to have a person-centered model of supervision when we're talking about restricting people's lives, if that makes sense? So I'm going to briefly, I have a lot of, research questions kind of long, but just to give you an idea of what I'm looking for in this research is I'm looking specifically at what are the challenges of older adults in community supervision for those who are coming out of incarceration. What are those specific needs? And then what are the challenges also of the community supervision officers when they're working with older adults from their perspective? I'd like to know more about how equipped these officers feel in working with older people, if they've had any specific training. I imagine they have not, but asking about that, asking about what they know about this population and how they were educated on that population. And then I also want to dig into this person-centered framework. What does that mean to older adults on supervision? How do they define that? Do they perceive what they're receiving right now as person-centered? And then also asking the officers, how do they define person-centered supervision? My hypothesis, my guess is that these officers may not even know that that's what our department is saying that our model is, so they may be unfamiliar with the model altogether. But really asking them, how would they define that? How do they help that play out in their day-to-day job? But also maybe what policies hold them back from implementing a person-centered approach. And just my aims here, to learn about these challenges and barriers, to understand the preparedness and confidence of the officers in working with this population, and also to understand the perceptions of that person-centered approach. And hopefully, in the end, of course, is to determine some potential opportunities for Georgia and beyond Georgia to improve in this area. So my approach to this is it's qualitative. I hope to collect my data through, or plan to collect my data through in-depth interviews, semi-structured interviews. It's pretty exploratory, which is why I chose more of a grounded theory approach. In terms of, we do know some from the literature about this area, but as far as this person-centered model, I couldn't find a lot about that in the literature. As far as my recruitment, so far I've been recruiting through community organizations. I presented to a couple of groups in Georgia, which has resulted in some recruitment. And then I'm hoping from there to kind of use that snowball word of mouth. Hopefully that will lead people to tell others about the study and lead to me recruiting additional participants. I have little stars beside the criteria because one thing I want to get y'all's feedback on is how to incorporate people who don't quite match the exact criteria of my study. So far, because I'm still in my more pilot phase of interviews, I'm accepting pretty much anybody who reaches out and says they want to be interviewed. I try to find a way to make it work. And most of them so far have met the criteria, but some have not been on supervision for several years, so they're really looking back over time. I imagine that I'll have people under the age of 50 possibly reach out. That hasn't happened yet. And then I am looking for some diversity as far as race, age, and gender. Also tenure as far as the officers. I hope to get a little bit of a mix in terms of people who have been on the job maybe more than 10 years, less than 10 years, that sort of thing. And, so far, I'll talk about what I've collected so far, but surprisingly, I've had mostly women that I've interviewed, which has been, obviously not expected, but I'm hoping that as I continue to recruit, that I have more men so that I am capturing a more experience across gender. I am aiming for 20 to 25 interviews in each of these categories. So 20 to 25 people who are age 50 and older on community supervision, and 20 to 25 officers who are currently working as an officer. And I am paying participants $50 for the interview. So far, interviews have lasted 1 to 2 hours. I haven't had one go too much over 2 hours, but most of them have been at least 1 hour. So far, I have IRB approval, so I've gone through all of those hoops, so I'm able to collect data. I have received some small internal funding from my department, and then some small funding from the Gerontology Institute at Georgia State, so that I can, pilot my interview guide and start collecting data. My mentor advisor really wanted me to have some interviews under my belt before I defended my proposal defense. So I have been able to do that. I've completed actually 7 interviews. I didn't update this slide. I've completed 7 interviews with older adults who are on supervision or have experience with supervision. And then I have 2 additional older adults scheduled. And then I have had in the last week 3 community supervision officers reach out about interviews. I haven't scheduled those yet, but I'm hoping those do happen. So I'm estimating that I have about 10 to 12 interviews complete by the end of the year. And then of course on December 16th, have my proposal defense. So what I'm hearing so far from my interviews, which, is very, only 7 people so far, but what I've heard so far is that the conditions of their parole and probation are restrictive. They've talked about things like getting permission to travel outside of the state and visiting family. They've talked about being afraid of being in places that serve alcohol, and those restrictions. They've talked about just in general restrictions in terms of finding housing and finding jobs due to their record, their background. One thing that I didn't ask directly about in my interview guide, but I'm thinking about adding because it's come up several times, is people have talked about their experience with receiving healthcare in prison. And a lot of these stories have been, as you all know and can imagine, have been really traumatic. And, you know, as I continue to hear those stories, you know, there could be something in that data that I want to look deeper into. But I have had at least 3 people so far talk about some really heavy experiences with receiving healthcare or being neglected of healthcare in prison. One thing that has come up that it's just due to my own ignorance of the system is a lot of my questions are about someone's current experience with their community supervision officer. So the meetings they're having with them, the interactions they're having with them. But several of these people have been in what they call a non-reporting status. So they have no contact with that officer other than, I think it's monthly, they have to dial into a number and answer some questions on their phone, and that's it. So so all of my questions kind of about those interactions haven't really applied. They've had to think about further back into their supervision process on what those interactions were like. So I've tried to come up with some follow-up questions around that so that I'm getting something meaningful from that. And I'd love to hear if people have thoughts around that. And then when I've asked them about their thoughts on person-centeredness, you know, most have said, you know, the supervision I'm receiving is not person-centered, and most have kind of even laughed at that. One person said, I do believe it's person-centered, and he strongly was very positive about his experience and said that it is person-centered to him, but that's been just one of the 7. I do ask about words and language and how language matters and does it matter to them. All of them have said that language does matter, and the way people refer to them matters in terms of speaking about their criminal legal background. Several of them have said they prefer the term returning citizen. And I had one person say, I hate that term, I don't like that term. So I think the language piece is going to be really interesting. And, you know, a couple of people said, I don't want to be referred to as anything, I want to just be called by my name. And then several people have brought up their time in prison or in jail and how they were talked to there and referred to by a number or by just inmate, and how language was important to them in their incarceration experience. As expected, and as you all probably know, the experiences have just been so different, and they've all kind of talked about having, some of them had several different officers, or they have friends who have a different, you know, officer, saying their experience really depends on that community supervision officer. So that person's kind of approach to their job, their personality, that kind of dictates how that experience goes. Several of them have, when I ask about the person-centeredness, they say, well, how could it be person-centered when my PO is like so overburdened and they have such high caseloads? How could they be person-centered to me? They don't have time for me. One person talked about when they go, have to go to the office to meet with their officer, there's, they have to wait for several hours. You have to kind of clear out your whole day because they're never on time, and how many people are standing there waiting around, and everything feels disorganized. And then I think I mentioned this, just harder to find employment. Some mentioned, I can't do the things I used to do in terms of work. Some have mentioned technology as a burden, like I didn't know how to apply for jobs in this way, in this time. And so that's been interesting to hear. So these are, briefly just my challenges and the areas that I'd like to get feedback on if people are open to it. I have had trouble recruiting officers. So I've been, I tried to work directly with the Department of Community Supervision so that I could have the green light from them, and hopefully they could send something out to their officers. And my research request was denied. And in kind of following up on why it was denied, I didn't really get a super clear answer. So I've tried a couple of different methods on recruiting officers that have not panned out. The only thing that has worked so far, how I've gotten these 3 people to contact me, is another faculty member in my department happens to be doing some work with DCS, and she said, after she's done interviewing her participants or working with them, she says, would you like to be contacted in the future if there's other studies? And the ones who have said yes, she sent my information to them. So I'm very hopeful that these 3 people will follow through and I'll be able to interview them. And then that will kind of snowball to other people. However, I just want to be able to anticipate that that's not going to happen, and I might need to be more creative in recruitment of officers. And then I'd also like some feedback just on overall approach. If people, saw my research questions and think, any of them need improvement, or maybe some areas I'm not thinking about, I'd love for feedback on that. If there's ideas for literature that I should make sure I review and consider, please feel free to suggest that. As far as funding sources, I have a couple of grants in mind that I'm going to apply for, but I'd love to hear if something popped in your head like that, might be a good funding opportunity. I just need funding to pay the rest of my participants and then hopefully for transcription. And then also would like to get people's thoughts, especially those of you with extensive qualitative experience. I have these participants that don't exactly meet my criteria and kind of how to work with that in my data. And then also wanted to mention that the way I've recruited most of these participants have been through a forensic peer mentor group in Georgia. So people who have been trained, who have lived experience of incarceration, who are now working in some type of advocacy realm, working with other people who are incarcerated. So I know that kind of sample, if you want to call it that, is a little, it's a different, I guess, group of people. So I'm hoping to recruit people outside of that group as well, but most of them have been from that presentation I did to that group. And then if anybody is, just really interested, I'd love, I'd be happy to send my interview guide if anybody wants to provide any feedback on that. And also want to mention my advisor, my chair of my dissertation, he is not a qualitative researcher. And so that's also been a little bit of a hurdle because some of this, he's just not familiar with. And so I do have others on my committee who are qualitative researchers, and I have some gerontology mentors who are, but just want to throw that out there as another challenge that I'm encountering. Yeah, and so that's all I have for as far as my slides. I know I went through it quickly, but I wanted to make sure I just had enough time where people could give feedback and ask questions.
Thank you. Well, I saw Johnny just unmuted. You want to ask go ahead. Yeah, you had a great point in asking maybe people if they wanted to refer their own probation parole officers.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I have to jump over early, so I'll just kind of like share my questions, but also, I'll share my email. We can totally connect offline. In terms of organizations, I'm not sure who you like discussing with, talking to with folks in Georgia beyond the folks that you mentioned, but there's a number of like grassroots orgs that you can totally connect to. One of the states that we work in, we work specifically on advancing legislation to end solitary confinement in 20 states, and Georgia is one of them. So Restore Her, a woman named Pamela Wynn leads that organization. She works with formerly incarcerated women who've been impacted by the system, who may also have like folks in her network. And then I think the formerly incarcerated convicted people's movement, FICP-FAMM, Convicted Peoples and Families Movement. They have a number of different chapters around the country. I do believe they had Georgia's one of them. I'm strongly that we just had a conference there. And they'll be able to kind of like blast out, your ask. So if you don't already have it like as a one pager and that kind of thing. And then in terms of the community, I would also think about the faith, doing some faith outreach. There's definitely folks in faith communities who welcome these people home and who work with these folks, directly and that kind of thing. So not necessarily like how long I'm think about like Ebenezer Church, I know has been doing some work there. And also one other organization I work directly with folks who've been impacted is the Southern Center for, I always get them mixed up. Southern Center for Poverty Law.
Southern Poverty Law Center.
There you go. Thank you. Yeah. There's another one that I know is focused on eventually, but also works directly with folks. In terms of funding, off the top of my head, totally talk to, and I don't know how funding is a thing. The Honor Foundation has funded some research in the past, and I know, they're like currently funding some participatory action research now with folks inside, where they co-produce surveys and some research questions, to kind of currently look at conditions. But I know they've been kind of like known to fund like this type of work before. And then lastly, in terms of recruitment, think of people who you're either interviewed as, potential partners, whether they have other folks that they can recommend, including their own officers. That might get tricky if they don't have a good relationship. When I was personally on parole, I can recommend my PO and they'll say, hey, share and like do that kind of thing. So I'm not sure what that looks like from your perspective, but they may have some insights. And then also some of these organizations also that have existing relationships with some of these offices that you may be able to also leverage. And then lastly, if you send me the one pager, I can also share amongst our networks and see who would just like get some buy-in. So, and I apologize in advance for having to leave.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All of that was very helpful.
Thank you, Johnny. Stephanie, I see your hand. Go ahead.
See if I can lower it. Okay. So Victoria, I'm stoked about your project. I've been excited about it since you started thinking about it a year ago. I had a lot of ideas during your presentation. I just wanted to make sure you said DOC denied your request for research, correct?
Yes, our Department of Corrections, when that was my kind of original plan, as you probably remember, and they denied me in multiple ways. So
Yes.
I just kind of switched to community supervision, and they also denied my research request.
So I'm sorry and welcome to the club. That means you've been formally admitted to the criminal justice primary data
I'm there
collection.
too. Yes.
Yeah. And if you get so many rejections, there's like a punch card and you get a free sandwich or something. So a couple of things, because you haven't codified it maybe yet, and I know you're going to do the proposal and then go back and forth between the IRB. Since they've locked you out, you can expand your criteria in a few ways. One, because a lot of the people on this call have built evidence surrounding accelerated aging. You can drop your age inclusion criteria much lower. And I think you can justify that as recognizing folks with these criminal justice touch points, age, psychosocially much older than their community-based peers. So you could probably drop your criteria down to 40, okay, I think, and be safe. Likewise, I'd note you could seek recruitment through folks who've retired from DOC because they are no longer subject to the restrictions put forth by their organization. You can also go through the local chapters of unions for individuals who are not necessarily employed contractually with DOC, but individuals who are employed privately. They do not fall under DOC requirements. And then the other thing you might want to consider, it would really broaden your research questions, but you might consider touching base with like adult children of formerly incarcerated older adults. Like from a social network perspective, you're a social worker, right? So, ecological systems, Brofenbrenner, like it would jive appropriately with your approach. So those are kind of some ideas that I had in terms of recruitment primarily. But then I also had like an unrelated question. When you were talking about what you heard in your interviews, like your kind of pre-interviews, you're hearing exactly what Megan Novisky and I are hearing in our study about correctional health services specifically. And I've just been recently faced with a new experience, which is someone explicitly identified allegations of abuse and neglect in a medical setting in the context of our relationship. So it wasn't on the actual survey, but I received an unsolicited letter that detailed egregious medical neglect and abuse of an elder. And so as a mandated reporter, which we are, right, I'm interested in knowing how you're going to approach that in your IRB, because I'll tell you from our lessons learned, I had in my consent that if you agreed to study and an individual, effectively says that there's allegations of abuse or neglect for children or adults, that I will call the Kentucky Cabinet for Family and Human Services. And so it happened. So I called per my protocol. And you know what they told me? They don't accept abuse reports for individuals who are not community dwelling.
Wow.
The folks in forensic hospitals, detention centers, juvenile detention centers. I was like, how did I not know this? How do I have 500 people in my study and didn't know that this policy did not protect that population? So there's actually, this is just our state, Catherine, but so I had this misunderstanding that the same pipeline by which I would traditionally make a report in practice was going to be a safeguard for making these anonymous reports if I encountered allegations of abuse and neglect in the context of my research. And so that is not a protection in our state. And I don't know what it is for Georgia.
So is that
But
through, so Stephanie, sorry, is that through your DHS or through your IRB?
Yeah, that's our
So your
Yes.
so Human Services in Kentucky is telling you.
Yes, they do not accept reports of abuse and neglect for people who are non-community dwelling, non-institution. So they'll do long-term care because those individuals receive state funds, but state agencies don't follow under their aegis or auspice or umbrella, or whatever the language is. So just think through that, because you're likely to encounter more reports like that.
Okay.
Yeah, buddy, it's a policy gap, Catherine. I was like, oh, so we're just going to exclude the however many people who are under supervision in the state of Kentucky. It's the first time it's ever happened to me, and I've been doing it for 5 years. So just like, get ready.
Yeah, thank you for that. I need to I'll talk with you maybe offline and maybe talk to you too, Jelaine, if that's okay, from a legal standpoint. Because I don't think I have anything in my consent form about that. And I, ignorantly didn't think about that it would come up. And then someone just kind of went into the story, and it was very traumatizing, and what I would consider harm, neglect, abuse. But yeah, thank you.
Jelaine, go ahead. See your hand up.
Yeah, clearly a policy gap, Stephanie. So maybe we should talk about that as a community and see whether or not that's pervasive across all 50 states, or at least, a subset of them. I am not volunteering to do a 50-state survey, just for the record, as the lawyer here. But to your point, Victoria, on that similar topic, you had asked whether or not you should amend your interview guide, because this issue is coming up. I think my instinct as a qualitative researcher is that if the data comes in naturally, it may give you something to use as preliminary data for a future study. But because it's sort of tangential or pretty tangential to your research questions, as I understand them, I don't know that I would explicitly ask that question, as interesting as it is, because I worry that by adding an explicit question, it might become a distraction from the questions that you're really trying to focus on in your dissertation. That's just my instinct of what I would do in a similar situation. I've certainly had many moments as a qualitative researcher where I wasn't intending on getting data, and the data just came in. But I'd actually be curious as to what Jen's experience is on this, because I know she also probably has had similar experiences.
Yeah.
And I like Fernando's 2-year-old's comments too. I think that's really profound and interesting, and we should ponder that too.
I know. I thought he was posting a link. I was about to copy and paste that, and it's a good thing I didn't.
Yeah.
I thought he was using his adult. The system is really messed up words.
Yeah, exactly. I was just thinking, because this isn't something that I've really thought about very explicitly, and like I'm also a social worker, but I'm not licensed, I'm not in practice, so I don't necessarily think of myself as being a mandated reporter in most contexts. And in research, my research is with adults, and so I was just saying, like, if a 40-year-old reports abuse, like, I'm not a mandated reporter for that. They can tell me that. I don't have to do anything with that information, and I don't talk to kids. And the older adult, I feel like in most states, right, it's like a messy line, right? Like, it's not like you have a birthday and then you become an older adult, or is it like when is it elder abuse and when is it just like regular old abuse of someone who, and I don't know what those lines are. So it does seem like there might be interesting things but yeah, I've never had that in my IRB. I mean, I know they ask questions in the IRB about if you expect.
Sounds like we need to write a paper.
Because it's an interesting question. But it's like, I get told about abuse inside prisons like every single time I do an interview, and it's never necessarily occurred to me to report it because it's just every single interview. And usually it's people talking in the past. That's the other thing. It's not people describing this happened to me today and I'm going back to the doctor tomorrow. It's this happened to me 2 years ago. So I think these are really interesting questions that like would be worth writing up, and someone should do that 50 state survey. That's, you know, not me either.
Yeah,
but-
Jelaine.
Yeah, exactly. Jelaine. Yeah, get on it.
I'm gonna need some more money from Arch to do that, and like a whole lot of law students.
Amen. But so Victoria, to your point, this might not be something that is going to be at the same demand. You guys are going to have a better command of GSUs like IRB, right? In Kentucky, at least at U of L, we could not get our project approved without explicitly stating what happens when we become aware of these types of things in this setting. Also, the department did require that we also violate confidentiality if a person plans to escape from prison. Now, again, these folks were in prison, right? So the context was different. But we had effectively 4 bullets: abuse, neglect, self-harm or homicide, plans to escape, that kind of kicked in another like set of actions, like adverse events, because they're adverse events. And then we had like disciplinary related tasks, which are as mandated reporters in the Commonwealth, we will also do these things. And I'm not licensed either, but just to say, like, walking away from a report of something really egregious, which you'll, hear over and over again. It didn't even feel appropriate for me not to be like, I need to talk to somebody else about that. Like, even if it's just my associate dean of research, even if it's not codified in a protocol.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because I definitely have seen that in other IRB like consent forms, and I don't have it in mind, and it's something I need to consider.
Well, I think just to the point of, we have it in our consent at our institution that if you disclose either child or elder abuse, but the problem is the elder part is not really defined. Child presumably is, under 18, but there's no real definition of, okay, what's the cutoff, or, what's the threshold for an elder? Yeah, do we all just wake up one day and now we're an elder? It depends, so that's an interesting question. Any other questions for Victoria? Or Victoria, do you have any additional questions for the group? Any other things that you would like input on?
I think that covers it. I think that, my biggest challenge is being that recruitment, which I got some great ideas on that. And I'm hoping that things start moving along now that I do have people reaching out that can, lead to others. I haven't interviewed any officers yet. And so one thing that's been in my mind as I prepare for that, so if anybody has advice, please feel free to share, is I'm trying to make sure, and my interview guide has been reviewed by several people, but I don't want to feel accusatory as I'm asking questions, in terms of, especially because my personal belief is that, community supervision cannot be person-centered, and that, I expect these people don't know anything about aging and older adults. And so I have all these, obviously biases, and I don't want to come across as saying like, you're not doing anything, you're not doing your job as I'm interviewing these officers, and just want to keep that in the back of my mind as I talk to them. It was much easier to talk to the older adults with lived experience. I didn't have that same fear. So just any thoughts on that, if anybody has any.
I'm just gonna jump in really quickly. One strategy that I took with, because my dissertation study is looking at something really similar as we've talked about, Victoria. So mine is focusing more on like, how do you perceive and respond, rather than like, why don't you do this kind of questions. So kind of like thinking about the directionality of the action, and just the way that it's kind of framed. The other piece that I would recommend is if you, and I'm happy to review your question guide as well. So the other thing that I would recommend is if you can pilot it on someone, whether or not it's from Georgia, like if you have a colleague who, I mean, even I think a police officer could be somebody that, I mean, they would have a similar-ish experience. So they would, if you have somebody that you can pilot it with, I think that would be really positive for you. If you've got that opportunity. The other piece I was just gonna add about your inclusion criteria is you said you're doing grounded theory, right?
Yes. I probably not classically grounded theory, but yes.
Because if you're doing grounded theory, I mean, it depends on how you're interpreting grounded theory, I guess, but if you're using theoretical sampling like grounded theory would prescribe, your sampling would follow what your conceptual matrix is developing, right? So if you're finding something in your conceptual matrix that would justify you expanding the age limit on your inclusion criteria, then that would be enough from a methodological perspective. That would be a well enough justification for you to interview somebody outside of those bounds that you've set. And same with because I think that's the same with like the corrections officers. If you have a reason, a concept, or something that has come up, a dimension within your conceptual model that you're developing within the methodology, your theoretical sampling would then justify you going outside of those bounds, and that would extend from the incarcerated folks as well as, or from the formerly incarcerated folks to the officers as well. So I think you have a little bit of a methodological buffer as well on your inclusion criteria.
Thank you.
Great comments. And I'll just jump into on the interview. And I have those like same anxieties and fears when it comes to interviewing people who work in corrections versus people who've lived in correctional settings or have like that lived experience. Like it feels so different to me. I feel like it makes me nervous. I feel like they're just going to look at me and like, see my like uber progressive, like, they're like, like, oh my gosh, your like abolitionist flag is showing and like, hate me. And I get really nervous. And, so I totally get that. And I think to me, I mean, the big things that I think about in any interview, and I think it's especially hard when you're sort of interviewing people when you're concerned about power differences or where you're concerned about, you have disagreements on things, is just remember that you're interviewing the human and not the system. Like these are people working within systems that are either broken or working exactly as designed, depending on your perspective on how we critique things. But they are not responsible for that system, and you're finding about how they work within it, which they also might see challenges with. They also might have things they disagree about with, and there's, so that's what you want to get to, is like how they work within these challenging systems. And yeah, like they're a person. And if you sort of start from the like, tell me about you, tell me about how you do your job, tell me about, what's challenging and what's good and what works well, and how do you approach your clients, and what are you, like, if you start there and like a lot of sort of the framework and the big questions and your questions about, doing person-centered whatever, which I agree, I have that same like, really, what does that mean thing? Like you can do that after the fact. Like that doesn't have to happen in the interview, and you can play around with different ways of asking about that. Like, oh, I saw on your website that this is the motto. Like, what does that mean? How do you do that in your job? But you don't even have to ask that. You can just ask how they do their job and learn from that. Or in the first interview, you just ask about how they do their job, and then sort of ease into or seek out over time how comfortable it is to ask some of these more pointed questions about what that looks like in practice, or how that meshes with their motto of whatever. So just start with like, you're a person who has a job that's really hard. How do you do that? Which is just the way to, that's how I try to do it, is take them. Don't think about the system for a minute. Think about the person you're talking to.
Okay. Thank you. And I assume once I start talking to the person, it will feel more like that. I think I'm just kind of worried.
It really does. And it's like, they'll be like, oh, blah, blah, blah. Did you see Georgia's sporting event thing? Or, they talk about their kids, or, I mean, like, yeah, I don't know any words for sports, but like you see the humanity really, really quickly, and that helps make connections, which I think makes it easier to talk about things that are challenging. And so that's where I try to start.
Thank you.
Which gets to questions of like, do they afford that humanity to everyone in their life the way we are doing to them? I don't know. But anyway, that's how we should all approach other humans. That's a good lesson, right?
Yeah, so far all of my interview experience in qualitative research has been, either outside of the criminal justice sphere, or it's been, people with some lived experience, not any with law enforcement or
Methodologically too, there's this case for you to make, you can make the case for doing an exploratory interview. If you can find somebody from the system that you could just say, like, this is what I want to do. These are the types of questions I want to ask. These are the questions I'm thinking about asking. Does that make sense? And then they can say yes or no. And that absolutely is aligned with the method. And I mean, there's I think Strauss talks about it in one of his, in I think his 1980 book. I can't remember which one, but there's like a whole section on developing the question guide. Sharmaz also talks about it pretty extensively. So I think methodologically, you've got a lot of buffer too, to make sure that your question guide is kind of nuanced appropriately, because it is hard.
Yeah.
But I think Jen's point about you're interviewing the person, not the system, like they're not the ones that made the system either. Like most of the time, they're not even like decision makers. They're just people that are following the rules. So just kind of keeping that in mind, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Any other additional thoughts or comments? It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, I've appreciated all of these. I'm excited to go forward, and feel free to reach out if any other ideas come to you, or any other work that you think like, I want to make sure she knows about this literature or this, thing that's going on, that I want to make sure I capture.
Okay.
I'll ask one other question. Sorry. Now I don't know who your advisor is. Anyway, you mentioned a little bit of healthcare. Are you talking about, sorry if I missed this, transitions in healthcare outside too? Are you talking about access to healthcare and how that fits into the system, or where does the health piece come in?
Yes, I'm asking them about their current health status and if however much they want to share about any health conditions or disabilities they have, and then following up with how they're accessing healthcare, and then how their officer has played a role in accessing healthcare. I haven't gotten, to be honest, from the interviews I've done so far, a lot of, richness there. I don't know if it's the way I'm asking. The other piece I didn't mention is I hope that I can expand with age. I have had a pretty young sample so far. People have been pretty young. Some of them have had a lot of chronic health conditions, but some of them have been super healthy and, haven't had a lot to say about that. So I hope to get a wider range of experiences there.
Okay, to be continued.
Thank you.
One final note from me, and then Linda, I'll give you a chance if there's any last minute announcements. So there several people have asked about working groups that we've had over the life course of Arch, and so we had initially had those working groups were kind of stood up, as you might recall, around our special issue journal articles, and sort of now we're hoping to kind of transition, and we're going to send out a survey in the coming weeks to kind of gauge interest in participating in the groups going forward, and then really shifting the focus on trying to get some collaborative grant applications submitted, and how we can best support that. But we're going to send out a brief survey to everyone over the next few weeks. Linda, anything I missed? Last final thoughts, parting words?
No, I think we've got everything. We will be sending out a newsletter, and while you'll receive an email link to that survey, it'll be repeated in the newsletter. We just wish everybody a wonderful year end. It's nice that we're slowly coming back in person, but it's really lovely to see everybody here. So wishing everybody well, and a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you again, Victoria. And we're look forward to hearing more about your project as it continues to develop.
Yes, thank you so much.
Bye, y'all.
All right.
Good luck, Victoria.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.